My son-in-law sent me a voicemail on a Tuesday morning, 14 seconds long. I've listened to it maybe 40 times since then. Not because it still hurts, but because I want to remember exactly how it felt the first time. When I was standing in my garage in Tucson, Arizona, coffee going cold on the workbench, hearing him say, "We need you to find somewhere else to stay, Leonard." Diane and I have talked about it, and honestly, this arrangement isn't working for us anymore. You're in the way. I saved it. Didn't delete it, didn't call back, didn't say a word to anyone for 3 days. I just smiled and started making a list. My name is Gordon Ashby. I'm 64 years old. Spent 31 years as a structural engineer before I took early retirement. And I'm telling you that profession teaches you one thing above everything else. A structure looks solid right up until the moment it doesn't. The failure is never a surprise to someone who's been reading the load calculations all along. I've been reading the load calculations on my son-in-law for 4 years. My daughter married Neil Drummond when she was 29. I'll be honest with you, I wanted to like him. I tried hard. He was good-looking in a rehearsed kind of way. The type who always seemed to be performing rather than living. Shook hands too firmly. Laughed a half-second after everyone else. Like he was checking the room before committing. My late wife Sandra would have said he had cold eyes. She was better at people than I ever was. She died 11 years ago, and I've been running on my own read of situations ever since. The first year, they were married. Neil and my daughter Jenna rented a house in Phoenix. Then Neil's consulting business, which I had never fully understood despite 3 separate explanations, went through what he called a rough patch. Jenna was pregnant with their first. They asked if they could stay with me in Tucson for a few months, just until Neil landed a new contract, and they could stabilize. I said yes without hesitating. Jenna is my only child. My house has 4 bedrooms, and I rattle around in it alone. Of course I said yes. Their daughter Phoebe was born 6 weeks after they moved in. She is the best thing in my life, and I want to be clear about that before I tell you everything else. The few months became a year, then 2, then 3. Neil's rough patch apparently had no floor. He worked sporadically, billing himself as an independent logistics consultant, which seemed to involve a lot of phone calls taken in my driveway and very few actual invoices. Jenna worked part-time at a dental office. Between them, they might have pulled in $55,000 in a good year. Their expenses suggested considerably more. 2 car payments, including one for a truck Neil needed for reasons I never fully traced. A wardrobe that Jenna apologetically described as networking clothes for Neil. Weekend trips they called essential for maintaining professional relationships. Meanwhile, I was carrying the mortgage on a house I'd paid off in 2019 and refinanced at their request to pull out equity for what Neil described as a bridge investment. I let him talk me into that in year 2. I'm not proud of it. Engineers make emotional decisions too, especially when their daughter is sitting across the table looking tired and hopeful. The shift happened gradually, then all at once, which is how these things always go. Neil started treating my house like a management position he'd been promoted into. He rearranged the garage without asking. He told Jenna that my workshop area was wasted square footage and suggested we could use it as a playroom for Phoebe. He stopped saying please when he asked me things and started saying we need, as in we need to talk about the internet bill, or we need to figure out the schedule for the guest bathroom. Guest bathroom. In my house. The comments about my age started around year 3. Subtle at first, Neil mentioning that a neighbor down the street had moved to a senior community and seemed really happy there. Jenna asking me twice in 1 month if I'd thought about what I wanted my next chapter to look like. Little phrases, softly delivered, persistently applied. Water on limestone. The cruelest one came at dinner on a Sunday in February. Neil was talking about some renovation he wanted to make to the back patio, referring to it as our patio. And I mentioned that I'd need to approve any structural changes since I owned the property. He looked at me across the table, that half-second delay before his face arranged itself, and said, "Gordon, nobody's questioning whose name is on the deed, but Jenna and I are the ones actually living here." Jenna said nothing. Phoebe was drawing horses on the back of a paper plate. I said, "Excuse me, got up, and went to my workshop. I sat there for a long time. I have a habit that probably sounds strange. I restore old hand planes. Woodworking tools, the kind carpenters used before power tools existed, I find them at estate sales, usually covered in rust and neglect, blades dull or missing, the wooden handles cracked. I bring them back. It takes patience, and it takes knowing which damage is cosmetic and which is structural, which parts can be saved and which need to be replaced entirely. I was working on a 1930s Stanley No. 5 that night. I ran my thumb along the edge of the blade and thought about what Neil had just said. The ones actually living here. I thought about the mortgage payment I made every month, the utilities in my name, the property tax bill that came to my name at my address, the grocery runs I made every Sunday because Neil didn't like the store brand, and I didn't say anything about it. Then I thought about a conversation I'd had with my attorney, Patricia Holm, about 3 months earlier. I hadn't gone to see her because of anything specific. I went because I'm an engineer and I believe in regular maintenance, and I've been watching the load calculations on this arrangement for long enough to know that I should probably have my paperwork in order. Patricia had asked me, almost as an afterthought as I was leaving, whether anyone other than me had their name on any of my assets. I told her Neil had co-signed on a small business line of credit I'd opened for him, with my account as backing collateral, and that he'd convinced me to add him as a secondary authorized user on one of my investment accounts for what he called administrative convenience. She looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "Gordon, I'd like you to come back next week so we can spend a little more time on this." I went back. We spent time on it. Over the following 2 months, we quietly made adjustments. I sat in my workshop that Sunday night, running an oil stone along the plane blade, and I thought, I am not angry. I am not even surprised. I am simply recognizing that the temporary arrangement has become permanent exploitation, and I have already done the preparation work, and now I am just waiting for the moment to begin. The voicemail from Neil was that moment. 14 seconds. "We need you to find somewhere else to stay, Leonard. Diane and I have talked about it. He got my name wrong. 4 years, and he called me Leonard. I don't know if he was nervous or if he genuinely couldn't be bothered to remember. I've thought about it, and I'm honestly not sure which answer is worse. I listened to it twice standing in the garage. Then I set my phone face down on the workbench, picked up the hand plane, and got back to work. The blade was almost right. Just a little more. I called Patricia home the next morning at 8:05. She answered on the second ring, which is one of the reasons I've trusted her for 15 years. "Patricia," I said, "I believe it's time to move forward with the things we discussed." A pause. Just a breath. The voicemail. "Yes. Do you have it saved?" "I have it saved." "Good. Come in Thursday. Bring everything." I spent Wednesday evening going through my files. I'm organized by nature, and that organization had become, over the past several months, quietly strategic. Property deed, Gordon Ashby. Sole owner. Utility accounts, Gordon Ashby. Mortgage statements, Gordon Ashby. Tax records going back to 2019, Gordon Ashby. The refinancing documents from 2 years ago, my signature authorizing the equity pull for a loan in Neil's business name that had since produced no documented revenue. The cosigner documentation on the business line of credit. That one was interesting. Patricia had walked me through it carefully. When a primary borrower's account is flagged for irregularities, she had been very precise about what constituted an irregularity. The backing collateral can be formally separated and the cosigner relationship dissolved, provided the collateral owner submits a written request and the account shows a pattern of non-repayment. Neil had made 2 payments on that line of credit in 18 months. I sat at my kitchen table with my files and my coffee, and I thought about Phoebe, who had fallen asleep on my shoulder the previous Thursday while I was reading to her, her little hand still wrapped around 3 crayons. I thought about how none of what was coming was going to be easy for her, or for Jenna, and how that pain was not something I had created. It was something Neil had built, piece by piece, over 4 years. And the fact that the people around him would feel the collapse was not my responsibility. You can't protect people from consequences they earned. You can only decide whether to let them keep earning them at your expense. Thursday's meeting with Patricia was 3 hours. We covered the property, the financial accounts, the business line of credit, and one additional element I'd been sitting on for 6 weeks. Documentation showing that Neil had used his authorized access to my investment account, the administrative convenience he'd requested, to make 2 transfers I had not authorized, small amounts, $800 and $1,200, moved to an external account I didn't recognize. Patricia looked at the documentation for a long moment. You've had this for 6 weeks. I wanted to have everything else in order first. She closed the folder. Gordon, this changes the conversation significantly. This isn't just eviction. This is potential fraud. I'm aware. I want to proceed carefully. I want the outcome to be legal, complete, and impossible to appeal. That's very much my preference as well. We left the fraud element aside for the moment as a reserve. The eviction documentation and the financial separation would move first. The other was a card I'd hold until I needed it, or didn't. I drove home as the afternoon light went amber over the Rincon Mountains. I've lived in Tucson for 22 years. I know this light. Sandra loved it. She called it the hour when Arizona apologizes for being so hot all day. I made dinner that night. Jenna and Neil ate at the kitchen table. Neil was on his phone for most of it. Phoebe ate 4 bites of chicken and then wanted to tell me about a dream she'd had involving a purple elephant and a rain store. I listened to every detail. Afterward, I did the dishes. Neil didn't offer to help. I noticed, not with anger, just with the calm clarity of someone who has already made their decisions and is simply waiting for the mechanism to engage. The 30-day notice was delivered by a process server on a Monday morning. I was not home. I was having breakfast at a diner downtown with my friend Walt Kowalski, who I've known for 30 years, and who was the only person I'd talked to about any of this. Walt listened to everything over eggs and coffee, then said, "About time," and changed the subject to the Diamondbacks. My phone started ringing at 9:47. Neil, then Jenna, then Neil again. I turned the ringer off and had a second cup of coffee. The notice was simple and clear. Gordon Ashby, sole owner of the property at 4118 Crestview Road, Tucson, Arizona, was formally requesting that current occupants Neil and Jenna Drummond either establish a rental agreement at market rate, $2,400 per month, consistent with comparable properties in the area, or vacate the premises within 30 days. Failure to comply would result in formal eviction proceedings under Arizona Revised Statute 33-1368. I'd asked Patricia to include the statute reference. Specificity matters. I answered Jenna's call that evening. She was crying, which I had expected, and I let her go for a while before I said anything. "Dad, you can't do this. We have nowhere to go. What about Phoebe? Phoebe is always welcome with me. The question is where the 4 of us will be living. And right now, the answer is that you have 30 days to figure that out. Neil says this is illegal. He says you can't evict family. I've lived in this house for 22 years, Jenna. My name is on every document associated with it. The law is very clear. He's talking about getting a lawyer. He's welcome to. My attorney is Patricia Holm. She's been practicing Arizona property law for 28 years. Neil should mention her name to whoever he consults, as a professional courtesy." Silence on the other end. Then, quietly, "Why didn't you just talk to us?" I thought about the Sunday dinner. Neil's voice, the ones actually living here. 4 years of small erasures, of guest bathrooms and wasted square footage, and the slow, deliberate process of making me feel like an inconvenience in my own life. "I've been trying to talk," I said. "I've been talking for 4 years. She didn't have an answer for that. I told her I loved her, that nothing about this changed that, and that the best thing she could do right now was think carefully and clearly about what she actually wanted her life to look like. I hung up and went to my workshop. The Stanley No. 5 was finished. I set it on the shelf and picked up a new project, a wooden-bodied rabbit plane, circa 1910, that I'd found at an estate sale in Marana. The sole was warped. The blade was cracked, Someone had tried to fix it at some point and made things worse, forced the wrong replacement parts into spaces they didn't fit. That's always the temptation with broken things. To force a solution rather than taking the time to find the right one. Neil found a lawyer. I know because Patricia called me a week into the 30-day period to tell me she'd received a letter from a firm in Phoenix claiming my son-in-law had reasonable expectation of continued tenancy based on his 4-year occupancy of the property and could not be removed without cause. Patricia's response took 1 page. It cited the property deed, the absence of any written rental agreement, the absence of any documented financial contribution to housing costs, and 4 years of utility statements in my name alone. She also noted, in the final paragraph, that her client had documentation of potentially fraudulent financial activity by the named occupant, and that this documentation had been preserved and was available to law enforcement upon request. Neil's lawyer did not respond after that. The 30 days expired on a Wednesday. By that point, Neil and Jenna had found an apartment in a complex near the university. 2 bedrooms, $1,650 a month. I know this because Jenna told me in a phone call that was painful and honest, and the first real conversation we'd had in years. She sounded exhausted. She also sounded very quietly like herself. I didn't know about the account transfers, she said. I want you to know that. I believe you. He said you'd authorize them. He said it was for a business expense. He said a lot of things. She went quiet. Then, I'm going to figure things out, Dad. I don't know how yet, but I am. I know you are. You're Sandra's daughter. She cried a little at that. So did I, though I'd never admit it to anyone but Walt. The morning they moved out, I sat on the back porch and drank coffee and didn't watch. I could hear the trucks, the voices, the particular kind of noise that leaving makes. Phoebe knocked on the porch door around 10 o'clock, still in her pajamas, holding a drawing she'd made. This is for you, Grandpa, she said. It was a house with a sun over it, and 2 figures in the yard, one tall and one very small. I held it for a long time. Who's the tall one? That's you, she said, and that's me. Where are we going? She shrugged with the absolute confidence of a 4-year-old. Nowhere. We live there. I hugged her until Neil called her name from the driveway. The business line of credit resolved 2 weeks later. With the backing collateral formally separated and the co-signer relationship dissolved, the lending institution conducted a credit review of Neil as sole borrower. He did not pass. The outstanding balance of $34,000 was called due in full within 15 days. He could not pay it. The account went to collections, and the default was reported to all 3 credit bureaus. I did not forward that information to anyone. I didn't need to. Patricia called me about the unauthorized transfers in mid-October. She'd consulted with a colleague who specialized in financial crime. The amounts were small, but the documentation was clean, and the pattern was clear. She asked me how I wanted to proceed. I thought about it for 2 days. Then I called the number of a detective at the Tucson Police Department that Patricia had given me and made an appointment. I want to be honest about this part. I did not go to the police because I wanted to destroy Neil. I went because what he had done was a crime, and because if I sat on evidence of a crime for my own comfort, I would be complicit in whatever he did next, to Jenna or to someone else. That's not justice. That's just choosing my own peace over someone else's protection. The detective's name was Brenda Howell. She was thorough and quiet, and she looked at my documentation for a long time before she said anything. You have good records, Mr. Ashby. I'm an engineer. I keep good records. This is enough to open a case. Then I'd like you to open one. Neil was charged with 2 counts of unauthorized electronic transfer in November. He was not arrested. He was notified by mail that he was the subject of a criminal investigation and given the opportunity to provide a statement. His attorney, a different one from the property dispute, responded on his behalf. The process would take months, maybe longer, and I accepted that. I found out through Jenna, not through any legal notification, because by then, Jenna and Neil were in the early stages of a separation she had initiated. She called me on a Sunday evening, a different kind of call than we'd been having, quieter and more direct. He transferred money from your account, she said. He told me you knew. I know he told you that, but you didn't know. No. She was quiet for a long time. I keep thinking about all the things he told me you knew about. I imagine there were several. Dad. Her voice broke a little. I'm sorry. For all of it. For not seeing it sooner. For not saying anything when he said those things to you. For letting it go on as long as it did. You were in it, I said. It's harder to see when you're in it. You saw it. I'm on the outside of my own life. Old people see things. It's the only advantage of the age. She laughed, which surprised both of us. We talked for an hour. The longest we'd talked in years. She told me about the apartment, about Phoebe's new preschool 2 blocks away, about her plan to go back to working full-time. She sounded like someone who had put down something very heavy and was still getting used to the unfamiliar lightness of her own hands. Before we got off the phone, she said, "Can I bring Phoebe to see you this weekend?" "I'll make the pancakes she likes," I said, "with the blueberries." "She'll lose her mind. I'm counting on it." I spent the following weeks putting the house back to how I liked it. Not dramatically. I didn't rip anything out or repaint. I just quietly restored what had drifted, moved the furniture back to positions that made sense to me. Reclaimed the workshop. Put Sandra's photograph back in the living room, where it had been before Neil mentioned once that it made the space feel heavy. I found 3 of my hand planes on a shelf in the guest room closet. Neil had moved them there, apparently, to make room for sports equipment I'd never seen used. I put them back on the workshop bench where they belonged and stood there for a minute, just looking at them. In January, I had coffee with a woman I'd met at a woodworking club downtown. Her name is Sylvia Marsh, and she is 61, and she restores furniture the same patient, methodical way I restore tools. She has a good sense of humor, and she asks questions and she listens to the answers, which sounds like a low bar until you've spent 4 years living with someone who does neither. I mention Sylvia not because she's the point of this story, but because she's part of what the story is actually about, which is not Neil and not revenge, and not even justice exactly. It's about what's left when you stop subsidizing your own diminishment. It turns out quite a lot is left, more than I remembered. Phoebe comes every Saturday now. We have a system, pancakes first, then whatever project she's invented. Last week it was a birdhouse designed, in her words, to be big enough for a family of birds that are friends. We worked on it for 3 hours. She held the pieces while I nailed them together. She was very serious about it. When it was done, she put her hands on her hips and studied it the way I study a finished restoration. Then she said, "Grandpa, it's good." "I think so too," I said. Neil's case is still moving through the system. I don't follow it closely. Patricia keeps me informed of the significant developments, and I respond when I need to, and otherwise I've let it run the way a well-designed mechanism runs, without requiring my constant attention. Jenna texted me last week to say she'd been offered a full-time position at a dental office in Midtown, better pay, closer to Phoebe's school. She included 3 exclamation points, which is 2 more than she's used in any text she's sent me in 4 years. I wrote back, "Sandra would be proud, so am I." She sent a heart. I keep Neil's voicemail on my phone, not because I need it anymore. The legal proceedings don't require it. Patricia has certified copies of everything. I keep it because it's 14 seconds that changed the direction of my life, and I think it's worth remembering what that felt like. Standing in the garage with cold coffee, listening to a man who couldn't remember my name tell me I was in the way. The thing he didn't understand, the thing that type of person never understands, is that being in the way is only a problem if you decide to stay still. I didn't stay still. I made a list. I'm an engineer. I know how structures work, which ones hold and which ones are already failing, which damage is cosmetic and which has compromised the foundation. I knew, the moment I heard those 14 seconds, That I was looking at a structure that had been compromised for years. The only question was whether I was going to keep holding it up, or step back and let physics do what physics does. I stepped back. The house on Crestview Road is mine again, in every sense that matters. The workshop is mine. The photographs are mine. The Saturday mornings with Phoebe and the blueberry pancakes and the birdhouses built to spec are mine. And the quiet in the evenings when I sit on the back porch and watch the light go amber over the mountains. The light Sandra called Arizona's apology. That's mine too. It always was. I just had to remember it. People ask me sometimes if I regret waiting as long as I did. 4 years is a long time to let something go the wrong direction, and I understand why the question comes up. Because from the outside it probably looks like patience, or maybe like weakness, like a man who couldn't see what was happening right in front of him. But here's what I've figured out, and I didn't fully understand it until I was sitting on my back porch the morning after Neil and Jenna moved out, watching the light come up over the mountains. There's a difference between waiting and preparing. I wasn't tolerating the situation. I was reading it. Every engineer I've ever respected will tell you that the most dangerous thing you can do with a failing structure is react too fast. Make a move before you understand the load, before you know which elements are actually bearing weight and which ones just look like they are. You act before you're ready. You make it worse. You take the time to understand the system first, and when you move clean. That's what I did. I'm not saying it was easy. There were nights I sat in that workshop with a hand plane I wasn't really working on, just holding it, thinking about Sandra, thinking about Jenna at 8 years old, asking me to explain how bridges stayed up, thinking about the version of my life I'd expected and the version I was living instead. Those nights were hard. But hard isn't the same as wrong. What I keep coming back to, the thing that feels most true when I sit with it, is that Neil wasn't the real problem. Neil was a symptom. The real problem was that I had confused love with obligation and generosity with surrender. I thought being a good father meant absorbing whatever came without complaint, that saying nothing was the same as being gracious, that holding the structure up no matter the cost was what family required. It took 4 years and a 14-second voicemail for me to understand that none of that is actually love. That's just the story people tell themselves when they're afraid to draw a line. Jenna is figuring things out. She called me last Sunday and she sounded steadier than she has in years. A little tired still, but grounded in a way that felt real. She's doing the hard work of rebuilding, and I respect her for it more than I can say. The choices she made during those 4 years were hers, and the consequences were hers too, and she's not running from them. That takes something. That takes the kind of character that doesn't come from easy circumstances. Phoebe came over Saturday. We finished the birdhouse and started on a small shelf for her room. She is 4 years old and absolutely certain about everything, and being around her reminds me that the future is not a fixed thing. It's built piece by piece, out of the choices you make and the standards you hold and the willingness to do the harder right thing instead of the easier wrong one. I'm not angry. That's the part people find hard to believe. But what would anger do for me now? The mechanism ran. The consequences landed where they belonged. I have my house, my workshop, my Saturday mornings, and a life that feels like mine again. Neil has the results of 4 years of his own decisions. That's not cruelty. That's just how things work when you stop interfering with the math. The hand plane I finished that last week before everything changed still sits on the top shelf of my workshop. I look at it sometimes when I'm starting a new project. Broken thing, now running true. Took patience. Took the right tools. Took knowing which parts could be saved. That's all any of this ever was.